Okay, so this afternoon what we're going to do is we're going to focus on some practical application of this. Now this has always been a great struggle for me as to how to do some sort of workshop with people without installing our full software. And for our full software you need Microsoft Windows, you need Excel, it's and then we spend like 4 or 5 days training you, and it's a big process. When we're looking at training younger people, they would prefer to just get it all from a browser. Maybe you can get it on their phone or their iPad. And so what we've done is we've created a system especially for that. So I've sent you a link. If you go to our normal website, so www.cometstrategy.com, and there's an option under software, rapid online analysis. If you click on that, this talks a little bit about COMET 1. So not many people know us for COMET 1. So this is quite new. And then at the bottom of this page, there's a link that you can go to where it says start learning for free by registering, and use the sample data sets provided until you're ready to evaluate them on your own data set. So if you click on that, you get something that looks a bit like this. Okay, so if you can fill it out, you guys all know how to fill this out, so I'll leave that. Then what happens is when you say register, so once you've registered, you should get a page something like that. And what will happen then is an email will be sent to you to just confirm that that's really, that you have access to that email account. And so in terms of what you should get, okay, so what you should get is an email something like this, where you'll go down and click this link to activate it. So there's a couple of things on this email. There's the link to activate the account. That just sort of confirms that you're not just putting in a rubbish email. So to confirm the account or activate the account, that's the button. And then you'll also notice that towards the bottom here you have a couple of links. One is for the activation, the second one is to log in. So once you've activated your account, then you can click this link to log in. Okay, so the idea here is that I really wanted people to be able to put in their own numbers, look at the optimization, try something else, look again, explore, really be able to have a good look at how these cut-off grade and scheduling decisions are made, and how the value is formed, and how to identify value drivers. And so that's really what this is for. So if I give you a bird's eye view of the program for a start, so it is all based on a website. So anyone can kind of use it around the globe. For those of you that prefer Spanish or prefer something else, there's all of Google's 100 and something languages are here. So it's on a website. The first thing that you notice here is that we have the kind of the details a little bit hidden. We just sort of start off with some results. So the idea is it's not hard to create a schedule with COMET 1. It's a very, you're instantly looking at some results. They're kind of useful results. So the bird's eye view is that we have, at the top we have a couple of different cases. You might not have underground. You can have one of these other cases as well. So these are preloaded data sets that we have. So people can go and grab a data set and straight away use something. We're actually going to be using this, the Mina de Antarctica, 10 sequence 1. So you can select that one if you like. And what will happen is that when you select the new case, it'll go and get that data and display, and it'll actually optimize it live. And so that little time that's taking is actually to send the data, to analyze it and send the results back. We have the option to do some comparisons, so we'll be going through that later today. We have a whole bunch of input parameters, but rather than starting off there, we can expand that and have a look at those. But rather than starting there, we're just going to have a look at the results that we have. So we've structured this in a way that should be useful for people. So we've tried to put the most important things, the things they really want to look at first, at the top. So that's why we've put the net present value at the top. Like, that's a key number that you want to know what the net present value is. Also, people quite like to know what the life is. That gives you an idea of what's happening with the cut-off grade and any other policies that you have going on. How many tons of ore? When does the mine life finish? So there's a couple of numbers that you want, but really you want to have an understanding of how do you generate those numbers. So we've got a mining schedule here for a start. So we have mass plotted on the left axis, the grey being the waste, the blue being what's being processed. And then the dashed blue line is the cut-off grade policy that's being employed. Again, a variable cut-off grade, similar sort of data set to the one that I showed you before, with the example of the theory. So you can see it's a variable cut-off grade where we actually get quite close to mine constraint here at 70 million tonnes. We're filling our mill pretty close to filling a 25 million tonne mill capacity all the time, except for in the first year when we're just under the mill capacity, but we've actually hit our mining capacity. The next chart is about the economics. So you have the total revenue, the total costs. So the revenue's in green, the costs are in red, and then the profit in blue. Over the life of the project, and then the dashed line is the discounted profit over the life of the project. So trying to give people a visual of what is what's happening behind the scenes. And then the last bit of data, you can see there's a table down at the bottom. Really, a lot of times there's more detail in that than what you really want. Often people want to look at the big picture numbers, the summary numbers. So we have the summary numbers across here. So if you're looking for the total mine life or the total cash flow, discounted cash flow, how much rock there is, we've got 881 million tonnes.
Are there any specific rules built in for the terminal value?
Are there any rules?
Yeah, for closure. I was just playing, let's say if the fixed annual costs are 0 and they make a very, very high closure costs, you would think that it would just try to defer closure forever?
Yes. Closure costs is an interesting one because economically, closure costs, you can have the parameters. If the closure cost is really big, it can be, maybe economics leads to the wrong word, maybe it's more mathematically. You can just keep delaying closure. You just pay the annual fees every year. You keep delaying closure and you'll actually get a better NPV. Realistically, that's not an option for us. You know, like, even if you started doing that mine, you would, government regulations and things, you wouldn't be able to do that. So we've actually taken the view with closure costs that even though technically there is a better NPV available if you did that kind of craziness, we still incur closure costs straight away. You know, as soon as the mine's finished, we incur the closure costs. The closure costs do, though, impact the schedule, so that if you've got a big closure cost, you'd expect the schedule to be stretched out a little bit. And these are the sort of examples that you can do. You can put another closure cost and see what happened to the schedule. So we'll be going through all the input parameters and seeing how that works. But you can see a whole lot of the number summaries for the case at the bottom here. And if you want the more detailed analysis, we actually have this particular data set has got 10 increments, and each of the increments that have then been divided into 5 sort of little increments, sub-increments, and so that we have 50 increments in total. And really whatever analysis we're going to do, it's always going to divide it into 50 increments of rock. And we're going to schedule the first one. When that's finished, we're going to schedule the next one. When that's finished, you schedule the next one. So you've got 50 little pieces of rock. You can vary the grade tonnage curve as you go through the rock, but that's what we're working with. So if you want any particular increment, so you see for bench 3, we've actually got 3.1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we have 5 little increments from bench 3. And you can see how much of, what was the cutoff grade that was applied to that? Well, that was 6.8. How much materials in it, how much went to ore, how much went to waste, and so on. So you can drill down into every little piece of rock, what went to ore, what went to waste, how much revenue you got, how much did it cost. So the detail is in there as well. So we have a project name, a discount rate. Really, the idea is that you don't really need this manual to do this. Like, I don't know, has anyone already changed a number, ran a case? Has anyone figured? Yep. Okay. That's the idea, is that it should be so straightforward that people can just sign in, run a case, and change a few things. It's fairly sensible. Yeah. Okay. So let's all together we'll make another case. Instead of this Minute Antarctica, let's just call it Perth test. How's that? So when you type Perth test and press tab, then what happens is it recalculates as you change the title there, so that now all the results will be under this new case called Perth test. So if we look at our input parameters, we can change our discount rate. So for example, say we want to change the discount rate to 15%. You can then click optimal preview. Just maybe remember what the NPV and the life was. So that's 7,745 and 16.65 years. And it'll be live sort of going and calculating what that is. So certainly the NPV dropped, which is what you'd expect, and the life also dropped. So I'll just set it back to 10% while we go through this. So I find going through the input parameters is a bit kind of boring for people. So I thought I'd just get straight into some comparison of different objectives. I said this morning how we really want to get the objectives right before we go and do all sorts of other analysis. So what I've got here, I've got the option to pick from a range of different objectives. You can see we've got another 5 of them up here. So if we pick the reserve cash flow, what that's going to do, the reserve cash flow is like, how do you make the most money from every little bit of the reserve? So really what will happen is you'll go down to a break-even cut-off grade, and if a bit of rock can make you money, then that's the schedule that we'll do. And you see now we've got a comparison of these 2 different schedules. We've got a little, firstly from a number point of view, we've got our base case maximised NPV, our alternate case, which was maximising the reserve cash flow. We lost about $1.6 billion. So that was a bit of a shame, 21%. So obviously, the different data sets you'll put in, you'll get different results, but this has actually come from real data. So they're not totally unrealistic, the numbers that we're getting. If anyone was to actually operate a mine with a break-even cut-off grade, to see a 20% increase in net present value is not unreasonable. Okay, so let's have a look at some other features here. So the thing is, okay, we've got 20% less value, but why is that? So, so if we have a look at the two schedules, you can see our base case up the top here, and you can see that it finished quite a lot earlier, and that the cut-off grade that it's using is quite a lot higher than this cut-off grade that we use for the maximising the reserve cash flow. We mine a lot less material. So all these diagrams are sort of scaled to the same scale. Both in time, both the vertical and the horizontal axes. So you can see, okay, we've got a longer life, and we've achieved that by dropping our cut-off grade, which means we have less waste, more ore. So our total amount of ore has increased. If we have a quick look at our amount of ore down the bottom with these numbers, you can see that our total amount of rock stays the same at 881 million, but our amount of ore has reduced from has increased from 415 million tonnes in our best NPV case to 629 million tonnes in our maximising the reserve cash flow. So even though we have got more ore, why is it that we didn't make more money? So if we have a look at these couple of charts here, you start to see the revenue side of things, that, okay, we've got money, the profit in blue here. It goes for a lot longer time, but a lot of that time is actually quite heavily discounted. Whereas this one here, the maximising the best NPV, you've got much higher cash flows in the early periods. You're sitting around around $1 million a year here, whereas we're sitting around 600 million in our maximising the reserve cash flow. So we're actually, even though there's a lot of cash flow being generated, you don't get it for a long time. So if you look at your cash flow down the bottom here, we've actually generated $16.4 billion of cash flow, undiscounted. But that only turned into $6 billion discounted. Whereas if you look at the maximising NPV, we only generated $14.8 billion, but it's generated a greater NPV because of the faster time. So does that make sense? See where? So you can see that, just by doing some quick analysis like this, you sort of, oh yeah, that's obvious. Of course you do that, and yet, break-even cut-off grades are actually used in practice quite a lot. And so to sort of get some numbers in front of people that need to learn these kind of things, it's not difficult for people. I'm sure all the engineers, mining engineers, can handle the complexity here. But just getting the numbers in front of them, and why is that? You'd think that would have been a good idea to make the most money of every block of material. You'd think surely that's going to give us the best value. But there's no discounting being taken into account. I wanted you to actually look at the results and just write a couple of comments about some of the questions that we have here. So like this you know, if I let you know the first one, and then we'll sort of talk through them. So, what was the change in cash flow? What was, did we increase the reserve? So they're pointed questions because people might not realise that what actually happened to the cash flow. We actually improved the cash flow. And the reserve, yeah, we improved the reserve. So why is it? How about the objective? We wanted to have more tonnes economically mined. We got it. But why was the mine life? Why did the mine life and the ore mass increase, but the value was lower? So you just kind of write a little comment there about the discounting and the impact of discounting. That even though the cash flow and the mine life and the ore mass had increased, because the cash flow happened so much later in the time, that's what drove the value lower. Has anyone seen this happening in real life using like break-even cut-off grades? 1, 2, yeah. It's pretty common, yeah. And the comment at the beginning that, you know, like this data set happened to give you 21% extra value. Is that in the right ballpark?
Yeah. Said it was low. There's an old saying around, it says all plus waste equals more ore. And I think that happens quite a few times.
Yeah. It's amazing how much value, like 20% more value, or Daniel was saying, could be more than that. And I've seen that more as well. Like, these are like really big numbers. Like, when you're dealing with, like most of the mines we work at are several $1 billion. So, you know, you find another 10% extra value. It's a really big number. It's worth doing this work and doing it well. And it's quite surprising that we've all got so much experience with this not being done well when it's so valuable.
Isn't this a bad reflection on the education in mine engineering?
I think so, yeah. I don't think the people are just kind of trying to give it to the shareholders. You know, I think they just don't kind of realise they're told one thing, the bosses. When your boss says do it this way, we want to make the most of the resource. You know, we're going to, if there's another dollar that we can make from that resource, then we want to get it. It sort of sounds sensible. But you need to do, you know, just that little bit more analysis to realise, well, that doesn't actually help the shareholders, you know, the value back to the shareholders. So why are you filling up this really expensive mill? Why are you filling up that mill that you paid a lot of money to get with this material that, you know, barely covers its own costs? So yeah, I don't think people sort of take it the next step. You know, they hear a good argument. Yep, that's great. We'll do that. You know, well, he's the boss. Like he told me to. He should know what he's doing.
Yeah, I think like what you said earlier in the day about there's so many different stakeholders, you know, marketing, plants, and all this kind of stuff. Being able to get them all on board with the numbers is a very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I look, for instance, at the mining schedule you have there in the optimal case, where the production capacity gets cut by half in 2026.
Yeah.
That would be a real hard sell.
Yeah, yeah. So why would you do that? You know, like, and often the optimized plans look ugly. You've got stuff going up and down and stuff like that, and you know, part of the situation with that is that people look at the mass mined and they say, oh look, we're up here, and you know, then we're down here, and then we're back up here. You know, we're hiring people, we're firing them, we're hiring them, we're firing, and you know, like that's a disaster. That's not a practical plan. And often it sort of comes back to the net present value, what's included and what's not included. So quite typically, we don't include hiring and firing costs. And so if you were to include that, it would probably take out some of those lumps and bumps. But also what you find is that in that situation, what you find is the mass mined is not a good reflection of hiring and firing, because the mass mined relates to the shovels, or in an open pit environment at least, the mass mined is more related to the shovels, and the shovels You might have one shovel, you might have 10 trucks that belong to it. So what you'd rather do is look at the people rather than the shovels, or the trucks would be a better thing to look at the truck hours rather than the mass mined. Because if you want to make the mass mined flat, then the truck hours will be going up and down like this, which have got a lot more people involved. If you make the truck hours flat, then the shovels will be going up and down. And so really what you'd want to do is, and several people do this, they actually look at people and say, well, I've got one person per, or 3 people per shovel, and I've got, for the different shifts, and how many people per truck, and if you're going to put a capacity, put it on people, not on mass. But when you present the reports, you present, like everyone wants to see a picture like that says mass mined and mass milled, and it's not, it doesn't directly relate to people hiring and firing. So, in some ways, you want to push back a bit on that. I mean, there's a good point that you're making, that it's not practical just to have these big ups and downs in the schedule. But there's also a sense that, well, let's monitor really what the problem with that is. Can we bring in some contractors for that period? Sometimes you'll have some fleet coming here and you've got a big jump. Well, just bring in some contractors for a couple of years. You don't actually hire and fire lots of people. You just contract that out. But if you have contractors doing it, you might have to add another 20% to your mining costs for that. So anything above this level gets contracted, add some more costs.
And Brett, I'd suggest also that the proxies you were talking about earlier come into this as well, that more tonnes, more ounces must obviously be better than less tonnes, less ounces. So there's this pseudo-correlate, you can demonstrate that it's negatively correlated.
Yeah.
The more tonnes and ounces, the less value you get.
Yeah. Those proxies are great a lot of the time, but when they're not aligned with net present value, that's when you've got the trouble. So it's many times I've heard people say, well, it doesn't really matter whether you use NPV or cash flow or cost, like they all give you the same result. Well, not all the time. Like sometimes they do all give you the same result, and sometimes wildly different. So in the cases where it's wildly different, you want to know which different one you're going to pick, and that's when you want to be able to look at the NPV. Okay, well, we don't have to take very long for this because it's pretty quick analysis. The annual cash flow. Did anyone look at those? So we can see, for a start, we can see the NPV dropped by, about 5%. Why is that? You don't just want to stop at the NPV. The NPV, great metric. I've been promoting it all morning, but you don't want to stop there because there are other factors that you want to understand why. So if we have a look at the cash flows from the different ones. Well, the total cash flow, we've actually gone down in the total cash flow. So what's happened? Dropped off the life? Yep. And how's that? How do we achieve a smaller life? So we've So we've increased the cut-off grade. There's a whole bunch of low cut-off grade options that we low cut-off grade material that's going to the waste dump now.
Is there stockpiles in the boat race here, Brett?
No, there's no stockpiles in either of the cases.
So having stockpiles and running that maximum period cash flow might give you a better answer overall.
Yeah. That's right. So That's right. There's a bunch of different things that you would do differently if you wanted to do a really, like a thorough analysis, and we're not doing that. But we are getting, like quite a bit of the information about what happens when you maximise the cash flow. Because has anyone come across people maximising the cash flow? Yeah. Like budgets is like a typical one that like it actually happens all the time. It seems like a really good idea, maximising the cash flow. Okay, so it seems like a good idea. You can see that the cash flows between these two cases, like they're actually quite similar for the first 5 years. They're virtually the same. But then in the best NPV case, the cash flows actually decline a little bit, whereas this other case, they just stay really high all the time. Whereas this other one, it starts off around $1 billion, but ends up dropping down to 750, 680, lower and lower. The best NPV case has more reserves. We've lost out on reserves, we've lost out on life. Our cash flow is actually lower, even though each year the cash flows were higher, the same or higher. But because we have less of them, that's where we've lost the value. It's kind of like the opposite case to the reserve cash flow from before. You got more reserves, but because it was spread out over so long, that's why we lost the value. So let's have a look at maximising the life. So I don't actually like promote or endorse some of these, but these are just things that you see out in the industry and concepts that you see out in the industry that you can like easily show are not a very good idea. So you embed these ideas into the wider mining community, and I'm really looking for supporters to help doing that. This is part of today as well. You embed this into the more general mining community, and they can come back with well, why would you want to do that? I think this next case is is particularly like that. This next one's where you're maximising the life. So let's have a go at doing that and see if you can figure out how we increase the life. So we've gone from 16.65 years up to 35 years. It's a pretty good increase in life there. Doubled the mine life, but halved the value. Did we increase the mine life? Yep. Went from 16 to 35 years. How'd we do that? Chris's comment from down here, ore plus waste equals more ore. Yeah, well, that's, yes, more ore, but it's not so valuable. Sorry? I still missed that. The cut-off grade, yeah, we dropped the cut-off grade right down to 0, yeah. So everything went to the mill. Now look, I don't know of anyone that's done this. Not to this extreme. This is an extreme case. And really, what I like about extremes is you can see that, oh, well that was a goofy thing to do. Like no one really drops it down to nothing. But it's funny how that concept does creep in. The idea of, you get some ore and you throw some waste in and now you've got more ore. I've seen that several times. And particularly when you're blending products, you have something that's got too much, iron ore that's got too much phos, and you've got too much silica, and you add some. It's got no iron in it, but it's got no phos or silica either. You add them together, and now you've got, you're within spec. Like something should fundamentally tell you there that that's not right. Like that's not healthy to be doing that, and maybe some of our contracts need to be rewritten and things like that, sure, but there should be, when you push it to an extreme like this, you can see that that's a goofy thing to do, just increase the mine life. Mixing waste in with ore just to get more ore is not a healthy thing.
but it's a positive NPV, so it's a perfectly legitimate chalk reserve.
Yeah, well, look, we still made money. You know, we still made $3.4 billion. So in terms of metal, yep, we've made a lot more metal, made a lot more gold. Great, you know. So yeah, it's sort of digging into it a little bit like that. You know, what did happen to the metal? You know, did it achieve what we wanted? You know, yes, well, we have produced more metal. You know, there's several times I've heard people say that we need to produce more copper, we need to produce more gold, we need to produce more of something. And this is the sort of technique that they say, well, okay, we'll just drop your cut-off grade. And yes, you will produce more copper, more gold, more something. But no, you won't make more money. That's a goofy thing to do. There needs to be some boundaries on this. You need to do those activities. It's a good idea. Like if you're a gold mine, make more gold. Yep, absolutely. But not, you know, there's a misconception in the mining industry that really what we're here for, like if you're a gold mine, what you're here for is to make gold. If you're a copper mine, you're here to make copper. That's a misconception. The truth is, if you're a gold mine, you're here to make money for the shareholders. If you're a copper mine, you're here to make money for the shareholders. And so that's, you know, like, but it's so easy just to hear that sort of, oh, you make more gold? Yeah, we're a gold mine, yep, let's do that. You know, it sort of comes to you in a bit of a subtle way. And so, you know, I hope these ridiculous examples actually reinforce the point that that's a goofy thing to do. In fact, what I would encourage people to do before you get to this sort of stage is just to get one grade tonnage curve for the whole inside the pit. And you can learn a lot based on that. But once and also what you can do, once you've got, you know, like, yeah, I think we're going to make another 5% more money because of, you know, more value to the shareholders because of doing this. Once you know that, well, then you can do the analysis properly, you know, because you say, oh, well, we make another, you know, $3.5 billion or something, or $350 million. I think it's worth doing a $200,000 study, you know, or $60,000 study. So that's, I think, where you can go. But I absolutely agree that, you know, like, this is not the final result that you'd use for a feasibility study. You know, like, this is training to understand the concepts. Once you get the concepts, you can actually use it to justify the proper work, and then you do that properly. There's tools and techniques, and we do the proper stuff all the time as our normal consulting business, but this is more of a training tool. Okay. The next one is another one of those slightly silly ones. We'll do it together. It's just maximizing the cut-off grade. Now, you can see that we've actually dropped a bit of value again, 25% value. I've actually limited how high I would increase the cut-off grade here. If you truly maximize the cut-off grade, you'll end up with no ore. So I just increased the cut-off grade till we got to our top bin of information and used that. So it's not actually as extreme as what, you know, some people think that you can do. But there is a concept in the industry that all that we really need to do is increase the cut-off grade. You know, grades are dropping in the deposit. You know, they're not as good as they were last year. They're predicted to get even lower. Just increase the cut-off grade. You know, and you think, okay, let's look at that. And yeah, so just increasing the cut-off grade can mean that you don't fill the mill. And if you look at the result here, you see the mill's actually got 25 million tonnes and it's not filling it. We've got 17, 19, 20. We're not filling the mill. So yes, we've increased the cut-off grade, not as much as we could have. That would have been even more ridiculous, but just to give people a bit of a sense. You know, we do actually make a decent amount of money. You know, like some of these years we've got, up around $1 billion. So they're not bad, the cash flows, but the life stops quick, and it's not actually the best cash flows you can get from the material, because there's some material that would pay you to process it that you've just thrown away, and you've got spare mill capacity. Okay. The next one. This is probably one of my favourites, this next one, because I see it so much. Minimising costs. Before you click that, you've probably already clicked it, but who's had a minimising cost thrown at them? Yeah, awesome. Okay. So this is where we throw a bit of a spanner in the works and saying, hey, look, we've just produced negative $3.6 billion. You'd be better off shutting down the mine than minimising these costs. So again, with this one, I didn't actually take it to the full extreme. The full extreme would be to shut down the mine. What I did with this one is that we still process, we still mine all the rock, but we have to figure out what cut-off grade should I apply when I mine it. So maybe you can have a look at the results for a minute, and then we'll see what we've come up with. Now, I don't see anyone doing this in practice. I know it's a ridiculous extreme, but people often still say reduce costs, as if that's your objective. And so even though they don't go to this extreme, like if you just go a little bit towards that, you still get a little bit of the results. So the concentrators are very expensive things to run. So we just increase the cut-off grade until we don't send anything to the concentrators.
As a normal course of events, you're always going to be asked to reduce costs. I mean, it's just a normal part of operations.
So what we need is a framework to reduce the costs. So an NPV framework to reduce costs. So when someone asks you to reduce the costs, say, yep, you should be doing that anyway. Like strategic planning people, I'm assuming you're all strategic planning people here. It's probably not quite true, but we should be looking at ways to reduce costs all the time anyway, because that increases the value. But if someone goes and asks you to reduce the costs and just says, we got to spend less on trucking. One of the things that's happened that I've seen is we've got partway through the mining cycle, and then there's some pushbacks which are not needed for another, like the ore is like 5 years away, and we're doing a budget for 2 years, and say, okay, well, we're going to stop stripping those pushbacks that are like 5 years away, because like we're in trouble now, and so we need to make more money next year. The grades are low, and this is happening, that's happening, so we just won't do that stripping. And so you'll reduce the costs, and great. And then, like 3 years' time, you can see that material that you need in 5 years, it's only like 3 years away now, and now you have to buy extra capital and trucks and shovels and a big process to overcome that problem that a couple of years ago you just stopped stripping. So if we stop stripping for a couple of years, then evaluate that and say, okay, we stopped it for a couple of years, and now we're going to look at buying some more trucks and shovels in 3 years' time. And look, that might be the better thing to do. Maybe that's not something you've done before, and you need to do that analysis. But it might not be also. So to do it without doing the analysis is the problem. Can anyone see where this would help, or where you've been asked to reduce costs and actually you sort of shoot yourself in the foot? Maybe not the current company you're working for, just in case, Has anyone seen that somewhere else? And maybe don't mention the company too. Yeah, what have you seen?
Well, during the GFC, we were told to shut down half the trucks. to save money than just mine ore.
Right. So it sort of stop stripping. Yeah. Just the stripping associated with the ore to get rid of that. But
Well, even if that we were told to avoid it.
Yeah.
It lasted for about a few weeks, but afterwards it was claimed it was a tremendous success, but nobody sort of follows up on the consequences further on down.
Yeah.
People sort of see what they want to see.
yeah, I think one of the other issues with mine planning is that you can create a schedule and you can make money, and you don't know how much money you're missing. All you know that is you've got a valid schedule and it's making a bunch of money. So you're making $3 billion, great. And maybe last year you predicted you'd only make 2.5, and now you're making 3, great. But if you could make 4 or 5 or 3.2, like you don't see that there's extra value. So unless you know where to look, you can just do a schedule and it makes money and everyone ticks it. All the senior management think, like it's all, like you guys are professional engineers, you know what you're doing, but don't maybe realise that, I didn't have time to do that analysis. I didn't have the resources. I didn't have the software. I didn't have, so I've done what they asked for. I did it by Friday, but and I told my immediate management that but more could be done. But by the time that gets 2 or 3 levels up, all those comments, feedback, caveats been lost. Yeah. So I think it's our role, doing strategic planning, to advise our management. Like when they say cut costs, that's fine. Let's cut the costs, do exactly, evaluate the option that they're interested in, but also evaluate. I think it's one of our roles is also to give them the best value for the shareholders' case. So yeah, I do this other case, I do that case, I do that case, but always do the best value for shareholders as well, even if it's on your weekend. Like that's what I'd do. I'd sort of make sure, yeah, I'll do all these other cases, but I'm not going to forget the one that maximises the value to the shareholders, because that's how I'd like to be treated if I was the shareholder. And so you can pass that information up, and you can say, look, if we do this case for cutting costs, we're going to lose $50 million, and we're going to have to buy 2 more shovels or get some contractors in next year. So you can do that. You can say to your management, this is the implications, and then look, you're clear. You've discharged your responsibility. Like you've passed it up, and then you sort of let management make their decisions. They do have other things that you're not aware of, and so that's fine. But to not make them aware that they're actually losing $50 million because of this, it could be that you pass it up to them and they say, look, we're losing $5 million here. They think, for $5 million, yeah, we'll do it anyway. It keeps the operation simple, or it does this or does that. Yeah, it's worth $5 million. But you say it's $50 million, they might think, oh wow, we could do a lot of hiring and firing, for $50 million, or we could just keep those people employed for the 2-year period, and we'll get them to do something else. For $50 million, it's a lot of money, and so passing that information on to your management, I think, is our role in strategic planning. And what management does with it, okay, when you're the manager, you can make that call, but for now, just pass on the best case, the best schedule. Cool. The algorithms used for this is the backwards algorithm. So I was able to use the backward algorithm in this case because I only have one sequence and I have no time varying properties, in which case the backwards algorithm is really super efficient. And that's just one of the limitations of it, though. You have those 2 limitations, but I deliberately made it that way so that it doesn't get too complex anyway. The other software that we have, yeah, it uses the forward successive approximation algorithm.
Yeah. Oh, so how do you know which methodology you're using? It's always backward, is it?
In COMET 1, it's the backwards one. It doesn't really matter, like from your point of view, from the user's point of view, it's been optimized. Whatever algorithm was, if I used linear programming or did something else, that would be fine. I'm just telling you, it is actually the backwards algorithm. But if I had to run these cases in our other software, I would have been using a forward successive approximation algorithm, and I would have got the same results.
Any views on closure cost? Because nowadays regulators doesn't want actually the faults to be remain there, and we are not doing anything about it. Yeah. So what's your views on that?
Well, the closure cost. Yeah, sure. Well, if you have a look at the detail here, you can see that we've got some initial capital injections, but also at the end, we've got what's called a terminal value, so which is our closure cost. So one of the conventions, and we'll talk about this when we get to the parameters, instead of talking about costs and revenues, I just talk about value. So a cost is just a negative value. So that's why it's a terminal value, not a closure cost. But yeah, we have that in there, and you can see you can change the terminal value and look at the schedule, and change it again and look at the schedule, and see how significant it is. Obviously, it'll increase or decrease the net present value, but does it actually change the schedule much? You know, does it change it in the next 2 years? You might be able to say, well, look, it doesn't really matter whether it's a mine that I used to work at. When I first went there, we didn't have any closure costs. It wasn't salvage value, but we didn't have any closure costs. A couple of years later, it was 30 million closure cost. A few years later, I went back there, it was 330 million. A few years later, went back there, it was 1.3 billion. It was a big mine, but like they become big numbers, and they do impact the schedule, and so you can put those numbers in, have a look at the schedule, and so if someone tells you, oh, we don't have a closure cost, okay, well let's run it and have a look, and say, look, probably like if we end up with a couple of $100 million for closure costs, I wonder what that would do to the schedule. Put it in. Actually, the next 5 years it doesn't impact it at all. I mean, it impacts the NPV, but it doesn't impact the decisions that you make in the first 5 years, perhaps in one situation. But in other scenarios, actually, it can impact right from day one, the closure costs. So it's something to look at, to analyse. Typically, like a lot of the mines I'm working with are like much more than 10 years mine life, in which case, by the time you get to closure costs, it's so far away that it doesn't really affect the first, say, 10 years, 10, 20 years. But as you get closer to closure, it does have a significant effect. So I think you should take it into account. Another engineer talked to me once when I was initially doing my research on my PhD on this. An engineer said to me, you should ignore closure, do your mine plan, and then you add the closure back in. And if it covers the closure costs, great, you got a project. If it doesn't, well, it wasn't that robust a project anyway, so you shouldn't have done it. I don't agree with that. Like sometimes it's the closure cost that makes the project, like considering closure cost is what makes the project viable. Particularly for long life projects, like you've already been mining for 50 years, and now you've got the last 10 years. And if you ignore closure cost, then it's maybe it's 8 years. If you add closure costs in, maybe you've got 10 years. So the closure cost stretches out the mine plan. Tends to do that by dropping the cut-off grade. And so why would you, like ignoring the closure cost, why would you race towards the end of the mine life and then a great big closure cost? Like it doesn't make much sense to do it that way. So yeah, I think you should include closure costs. Even if you don't have a very good estimate of it, still get the best estimate you can, I mean, all of our data, we've got assumptions with all of our data, whether it's closure costs or discount rate or price or, we know that lots of them are going to be wrong. But I'll have to find out who said the quote, that all models are wrong and some models are useful. Maybe someone can Google it and tell me later. I know Richard Wooler told me, so there you go. That's my quote, my reference. So, but whichever way you do it, like fundamentally, you have X to pay when you finish that area, and you need, whether you put it aside now or wait until you get there. Like miners would like to wait until they get there and then put it. Governments say no, just in case you go bust, and so you have to cover that cost though, and so that cost is what it is, and you can discount it back to today or you can put it in the future, but whatever your payments should be geared to that future value. And so it shouldn't really matter which way you pay for it, whether it's through bonds up front or insurance premiums up front. It's still, that's the amount, if it's 100 million in 5 years' time or something, you can sort of do it as annuities every year, or you can build a lump sum now. It should always end up as 100 million in a few years' time. It's, tax is a big area. And if you look at a model for a project, which, when you're talking about book values and depreciation, these kinds of things, tax is a really big area, and if you have a look at a model, then normally the straight out cash flow might be one page on the spreadsheet, and then the tax is another 10 or 15 pages on the spreadsheet, tabs. Normally, like tax is a really big item to pay. Of all your expenses, like it's 30% or something like that. It's a significant cost. So you do have to take it into account. But if tax basically works out as being 30%, like corporate tax rate, things like that, if that's basically what it means, is that then all your revenues are effectively 30% less and your costs are 30% less, so all your NPVs are 30% less. So that's quite often the case how people model it. Rather than putting 15 times more work for the 15 times tabs for tax, they'll often do a pre-tax evaluation, realizing that you say it's $10 billion, but actually after tax it's only $7 billion, and so you have to be careful. Like I think we can get $10 billion for this, and the management say $10 billion. I've only been hearing 7. Well, that's because ours are pre-tax 10 billion and yours are post-tax. So typically, tax can be approximated as a flat percentage, like 20%, 25, 30, 35. And if that's the case, you don't need to take into account in this kind of analysis for decision making. Should you buy the mill? Should you expand the mill? Should you buy some more trucks? If you do it pre-tax or post-tax, you get the same decision. You make less money if you take tax into account, but you make the same decisions.
Because I'm not sure if you make the same decisions, especially if you have tight OPEX CAPEX trade-offs, or capital will be depreciated over several years, which means your tax benefit is discounted over several years, so which means your actual discount cost is higher for a capital item, whereas on OPEX you can get the tax benefit straight away.
Perfect. Now, I absolutely agree. The thing is, if taxes can be approximated with just a number like 30%, then you don't have to model tax. When tax is not well approximated by a flat out number, so for example, I worked on a project in the Philippines where we had a 7-year tax holiday. So for 7 years you pay no tax, and then boom, you got 30% tax. That's a significant increase in costs. And so we modeled tax, crudely, but we modeled tax in that situation to realize no tax, no tax, no tax, 30% tax. And you see the schedule changes, like let's get as much revenue as we can in the first 7 years, and then, well, not so much motivation to get revenue in that period. Still wanting to get revenue early, but the 7 year actually made a significant difference. Another case where we've done that is in I was working on a bauxite project where we had billion-dollar smelters. How many of these billion-dollar smelters should we do? So, $1 billion is a lot of money, and the tax, like if you call it $1 billion or you call it 700 million, well, that's quite a big difference. And if you're comparing that with operating costs, like the difference because of tax and depreciation is actually quite significant. So what we did is the operating costs, I think we scaled them all down to like 70% of their value, but the capital costs, we only scaled down to 80% of the value. So it's a very crude way of modeling that book value, depreciation, things like that. But if they're really big numbers, then you should take them into account. One of the guys I mentioned before, Walter Schrapp, the New Zealander, he showed tax has a difference, it makes a difference. But it's really which tax regime you're talking about. If it's just kind of 30%, like most Australian mines, you don't have to take that into account. But if there's big capital items, big differences, then yes, you do. And typically what we'll do is that we'll run some cases, with COMET, and we'll do a pre-tax cash flow, and then we'll take that result and give it to a financial analyst. And the financial analyst, he'll put in tax, he'll put in shareholder differences, he'll put in all sorts of detail. The exact timing of the capital equipment, the ramp up for tax and things. So he'll put that in, and we'll have a set of cases, 1 to 10, this is the best one, the next best one, the next best one, so on. And then what will happen is we'll give those 10 cases to the financial analyst, he'll get them also. Now if case 1 and case 1 are the same, and case 2 and 2 is the next best, and case 3 is the next best, and so on, everything's fine. That's normally how it is. But if at some point, actually, case 4 is better than case 1, you sort of think, what's going on there? Well, you need to find out what's going on. And if it's tax, then you need to take tax into account. And if it's, some other power, like sometimes we'll just model power as a cost per tonne. Other times, like nearly every project I've worked on, we have just modeled power as being, it just gets thrown into the processing cost, so many dollars a tonne. But at Lahire, where, all that geothermal, springs they have geothermal energy, geothermal power plants. So it was really cheap until you hit the limit of the geothermal power plants, and then after that we had diesel sets to kick in. So we actually modeled power because that was a significant cost, and the difference between diesel and geothermal was quite significant. Likewise, there's another project in Brazil I worked on where we had hydropower coming, and so if you're within the hydro limits, it was much cheaper. If you're back to diesel, that's more expensive. So that's normally what happens. You do some analysis in COMET, you give it to a financial analyst, they go and look at it as well in more detail. If they don't match up, you start getting cases swapping around their order, then you go and find out why. It's a great checking technique as well, because often the financial analyst will look at your model and say, oh, you've stuffed up something, and I didn't realize that, and you fix it. Other times you say, actually, you stuffed up. Like they have the advantage because they're doing it second, so they can often pick their stuff up before they use yours to help them not make so many. Yeah, so tax is, come back to tax, big issue, but quite often you can just forget about it and model. And if it's just a percentage, you can ignore it. Okay. Yes?
Now you've got it started, do you typically put that back into the block model or something for design purposes or visualization?
Put what back into what model?
So all this data, so you've themed all your benches and all that kind of stuff, do you normally export that data back into models, or is it purely just a...
Yeah, well,
this data here is it's about understanding the concepts. So for this information here is you know, for training and learning and understanding the principles. But normally we will take this data, like from a more detailed analysis, you'll get actually for all the different pushbacks and benches, you'll get how much you mined from each area and what the cutoff grade was, you know, in each period, and so you'll take that and you go back and say, okay, these blocks are the ones going to the mill, those blocks are going to the stockpile, those ones are going to the leach, you know, these other ones going to waste dump. So yeah, you'll come back. Whether you actually put it into a block model or not depends on, sometimes there's a few steps between a strategic plan and what the guys will actually operate on. So we'll typically do strategic analysis on, to answer questions like, should we increase the mine capacity? Should we increase the mill capacity? When should we mine this area? When should we start that area? And how big should it be? So big picture decisions. And then as you get down into the, you know, the day-to-day, you've lost probably the ability to calculate an NPV. You know, you're just looking at cash flow and things like that. And so you just know that this year you need to mine so many tons from that waste pushback over there and so many tons from this pushback here with ore. And there's several levels of planning that will have happened between your strategic plan and your operation plan. So putting it back into a block model is more common for the operational sort of the day-to-day plan, whereas at the strategy you might be dealing with years, not days, in which case putting it back into a block model, you can put it back, but it's a rough put back. You might, for example, get end of period plots. So we'll take our software at the end of every period, you know, we write some files so that bring them into the other normal software, you know, generic mine planning programs, and generate end of period plots so that you can see, okay, with this, check that you're not undercutting something you shouldn't, that you've got ramp access, all that sort of thing. So that's what you're doing at the strategic level, whereas you're not, and it's just to the nearest bench. Whereas if you're doing a month plan, well, you can't really say that I have like 2.5 benches, or not 2.5, like a half a bench in a month, because it matters which half the bench you've got. Is it the high grade bit over here? Is it the waste over here? Is it a bit of both? It matters exactly what part of the bench you're mining. So yeah, we don't always take the strategic planning and put it straight into the block model. It's often a bit more crude at that level, but then as you go down through the different planning horizons, you start adding more and more detail, and then you start to get to individual blocks and what areas the shovel going to move to, that sort of thing. So the idea is that you start with a strategic plan that sets the context for you know, the next level plan, which might be still a life of mine plan, but you just don't have so many options with it. And the life of mine plan might set the context for a 5-year plan, and the 5-year plan sets the context for the 1-year plan, and you know, so on down to the, you know, what are we doing this shift. So when I say set the context, it's at some point during that process you lose the ability to calculate the net present value. You normally do. And so to set the context without having a net present value, you'll often do things like say, well, I want to mine this much waste and this much ore, you know, from this pit, from that pushback. So that's how you're setting the context. So by the time you get to the daily plan, you're not calculating NPV, but you do know you have to do so much stripping. And so that's how the net present value is sort of proxied into day-to-day operations. Is that good? Okay. Thanks for the questions. So we're going to be looking at chapter 8 now, which is all about mining and processing capacities and changing those. So we looked at, when we had a look at the equation for net present value, you could see how capacities formed a significant driver of value, and they're often not sort of really explored that much. You can go to a mine site and they will they'll talk about the constraint, you know, the crusher. Like, the crusher's our constraint. We can, you know, no point sending any more material because we just get crusher bound. And if you're not thinking big picture value, then it's like, well, that's it. You know, like, no point doing anything differently because we're crusher constrained. But if you're used to evaluating this sort of strategic analysis, or if you find out how important that is, you can say, well, how much is a new crusher? You know, and to install it, and, you know, all the bits and pieces. And look, maybe it's, you know, $30 million. Are you saving $30 million? You know, is there more than $30 million worth of revenue? And it's quite often something that people haven't done that analysis. You know, they see some sort of bottleneck and they just work within that bottleneck, thinking that surely someone else has thought of how big the crusher should be, and so I don't have to worry about it. You know, my job is to make sure it's full. But who actually is looking at whether the crusher is the best size? And that's what we've found is often missing. So, you know, we've talked about how constraints fit into the net present value calculation, and it's a great area of opportunity to increase the value for a project. Some of the projects, some of the bigger mining companies, have got whole teams dedicated to expansion studies. You know, they've got other names for it and things like that, but a large part of what they do is about expansion studies. And so they know that there's often value in expansions. So that's what we're going to have a look at in the next little bit. So there's a couple of easy ways to do this. Firstly, there's the ways that I've just got some options down here, like give me a 10% increase in mining capacity. What happens? What would you expect to happen? Well, I would expect to have higher value for a start, and probably lower life. So that's what happens when you pick that option of 10% increase in mining capacity. You can see that we've got another $57 million, and it was reduced our life by 0.34 years. So whenever you do this analysis, one of the things you want to do is to have an expectation of what's going to happen. So it's easy to stuff up things and you know, not realize what happened. So to have some sort of expectation that, look, I think it's going to increase the mine life because of some reason. And then if you get a schedule that goes the other way, then you can try to figure out why. Why is that? Like, higher prices is one of the areas that there's been a lot of debate about in some of the papers and things like that. Because some people will think, if the price jumps up this year, some people will think, well, we should make a whole bunch of money, you know, raise the cut-off grades, make as much copper or gold, whatever it is, say gold price goes up, quick, make as much money as you can from the gold, raise the cut-off grade, do, you know, more equipment, as much as you can. Other people say, great, gold price goes up, that means instead of, you know, 1 gram a tonne, now we can economically mine, you know, 0.8 grams a tonne. Drop the cut-off grade. Okay, so both schools of thought, you know, people have got their reasons for both. And what's nice is when you can just try it and see what happens. Now, in these examples, we don't have the option to have a price that changes over time. But for example, you know, what I've found in that is that if your cut-off grade, if your price changes say we get an increase in price, what will happen is if you're at the end of the schedule, your cut-off grade will probably go down, because now you can economically process some more low grade and you still make some money. If you're at the beginning of a schedule, with a long life to go, then normally your cut-off grade will go up, because it's a lot more valuable, this thing that's sitting behind you, so get to it more quickly. So rather than just having an argument about it, run the numbers and give it a whirl. Okay. So we've got a couple of standard options here. When we increase the mining capacity, when we increase the processing capacity, you can see there's no capital here. And so we didn't make much money from the increase in 10% increase in mining, but boy, we made nearly 7% extra money from the increase in processing capacity. So you think, oh, processing is a lot more valuable than mining. You might make those sort of conclusions, but really what you have to do is have a look at how much it costs to do those processing expansions or mining expansions. So in these kind of simplistic, increase the mining rate by 10%, the processing rate by 10%, both of them by 10%. There's no capital. So that's the next thing we're going to do now, is we're going to start having a look at capital. And see what impact the capital had. I'm just going to go back to just do the base case schedule, and we're going to start having a bit more of a look at the input parameters. But you can see, without sort of going into input parameters, just looking at those different comparison cases, you can start to get a bit of an idea of what's happening for a project and how the schedule responds to value and costs and cut-off grade. And okay, if we click on the input parameters, you can see there's 4 main groups of inputs that we have. There's the project information, so something that's constant for the whole project. So our discount rate is something constant for the whole project. Our capital injection, terminal value, they're both there as well. We don't have much period information because COMET 1 is restricted to just one cost or price over all time. So there's no time varying properties. Still, we have the year that it starts, and we have how much per year it costs to keep the project running. So people often use the expression fixed costs, fixed and variable. So there's, I think somewhere in here I have some definitions of costs. But if I give you a little summary of what that looks like, is that quite commonly in optimization studies, you really want costs that will flex with the scenarios that you're looking at. So if you're looking at a small mining fleet, large mining fleet, you want costs that adjust appropriately for that, because eventually you want NPVs that match, small mining fleet NPV, large mining fleet NPV. You want to end up with accurate NPVs. So often what people do is they divide their costs into fixed and variable costs. So it's important to get the fixed and variable cost drivers correct, like appropriate drivers. So if you put too much into fixed costs and then you scale up the project to be a really big one, well, you're not really scaling up the costs well. So you have to be careful that you just use the right sort of costs for those things. And just another throwaway comment about costs. I was at a project one time, met a guy from a bank, and he's a mining engineer, and he would come into mine sites that the banks had loaned them a bunch of money to start up, and then they were in trouble. And he would come into those projects and basically take over the control of it to try to recapture the value for the banks. And what he said was that when he goes in there, he assumes there's no such thing as fixed costs. thought, oh, that's crazy. Yeah, you're banking people, you don't really know what you're doing, do you? And what I did is me and a mate went through our costs and looked at the fixed variable split in a lot more detail. And we really did find it difficult from a strategic planning point of view to figure out what's fixed, many fixed costs. Like if you're looking at tomorrow, what the fixed costs are, then, for example, all your salaries would be fixed costs for tomorrow. But like next year or in 5 years' time, you're probably all variable costs. So the time horizon that you're looking at makes quite a big difference. You might be able to reduce some of your costs by like switching off trucks, and you can do that today. But so some costs are variable at any scale. Other costs become variable the longer scale you look at. And I thought it was a really good statement, a really good thing to have in your mind, that there's no fixed costs. And I guess the reason for that is that, well, what he was saying was that as soon as you say, oh, that's a fixed cost, it's like, don't touch me, like I'm fixed, I'm not changeable. And so, the mine's in trouble, but you can't touch me, like 2/3 of our costs are fixed, don't touch me. So he would go in and say, well, look, there's no such thing as fixed costs. And when you sort of start going through the costs, you sort of think, well, I used to think, well, we can have mine managers, like you need a mine manager for a mine. No matter whether it's a big mine or a small mine, you need a mine manager, so that's like a fixed cost. But actually, I've seen mines go from big projects down to smaller projects. And what happens is, initially, like they're, I don't know, like the stratum levels, they're a stratum 4. And then the mine gets a little bit smaller. It's like a general manager or a director. That's who's the mine manager. And then the mine gets a little bit lower, and now that's a general manager, not a director. And then a little bit smaller, then it's a principal engineer. And then it's a senior engineer. And then it's the local surveyor. And and then there's the kid that collects. So as the mine scales, maybe a lot of those costs do actually scale. You just have to find good drivers for them. So I've thought that's a really useful attitude to go in and look at costs. We still did find a couple of fixed costs. I think one of them was that we had a gyratory crusher, and there's a certain amount of energy just to keep that thing moving. And every now and again, rocks would come in, and they'd have to be crushed. Well, there's extra power for crushing rocks, but just to keep the thing going, that's pretty much a fixed cost, unless you switch the whole thing off. And so just think that's a useful sort of definition. The other thing to be careful of is capital and operating costs. So capital and operating cost isn't the same as fixed and variable. People often look at the operating costs and the variable costs and think, are they kind of the same? But the capital doesn't match well at all. Capital and operating costs are for tax. This is about depreciation. So depreciation and tax is very important. All the companies need to write those reports and submit that information. So very important that they have to have it. All the accountants would certainly know the split between capital and operating, and what you can write off, what write down for this or that. That's quite common. So, but some capital costs, for example, you build a mill. People say, oh, that's a capital cost. Yep, okay. That's like a fixed cost. Okay, it happens in this year, that's fine. But then they start saying, well, truck costs, they're capital costs too. Well, they're kind of fixed costs. Well, not really. Like the more mining you do, the more trucks you'll need. The more you use the trucks, the quicker you'll have to replace them. So a lot of those capital costs become are better modelled as variable costs. So there's a decent amount of energy that goes into figuring out what the right cost driver is for each one. So and also because the terminology is confusing, what's fixed and variable meant for different people, it sort of all means something different. Then we had 4 different classifications. So we had foundation costs, which were costs that basically it doesn't matter what you do in the mine plan, you still need to incur the cost. So, so sunk costs would fit into that. Things that you've already done, doesn't matter whether the mine makes a lot of money now or not, you've already sunk that. But future costs can be the same. So like an exploration drilling program, it can be, you know, like this is how much money it's going to cost for that drilling program. It doesn't matter if your production's high, production's low this year, we're still going to spend that on exploration. So that's what we've called foundation costs. There's other activity costs, which are, you know, like they're most of the variable costs, like cost per ton, cost per ounce, cost per, you know, concentrate tons, all those sort of things. What people normally think of as variable. What people call fixed costs normally fits into what we've renamed as period costs, because they're not completely fixed period costs. They're fixed for the periods until you get to the end of the mine life. And then if you add a few more years to the mine life, then you add a few more of those fixed costs. So, and if you take away a couple of years, you reduce some of those fixed costs. So there's a sort of period costs are a little bit fixed and a little bit variable. And there's also resource values that we also have, resource timing costs. So what they are is, when you move this chunk of rock, then you have to apply a cost to it. So if you mine an area that you need to move a creek, as soon as you mine a bit from there, you have to have already moved the creek and incur the cost for that, or move the power lines, or relocate a crusher, or, you know, those kind of things. So you need to have the right sort of cost drivers, and if you start putting resource timing costs and start calling them all costs, like a lot of people just, whatever the cost is, just throw it as $1 per ton for all. Well, you know, you get a bit average results. So, so some care needs to happen with costs. Okay, so what we're going to do on the top of page 8.4 is a set of analysis that we're going to do. We're going to look at the mining capacity, and we've got some capital costs for that. We've got some rock properties. So there's actually several categories within here of rock properties. We've got things like the attributes, which are like the copper grade, the gold grade, things like that, how they're weighted. Then we have the cut-off grades that we're going to use. We have the grade tonnage distribution. So this mining sequence here is basically a whole bunch of grade distributions as we go through the 10 different benches going through the sequence. We've also got the option at the bottom here to put in your own grade distributions. But we'll get to that at the end of the day. Now, most of our costs actually go in here under cash flow. So under cash flow, we have two parts for the cash flow. We have the ore part and we have the total rock part. Okay, so we have these two different parts. The first part where it says high grade, so the best material above the cut-off grade, this is what's going to happen to it. We can apply a recovery, we can apply a value, and we can apply a capacity. So what we've said is that for the material above whatever cut-off grade we end up picking, it's going to cost us $12 a tonne. And our capacity is going to be, for that, it's going to be 25 million tonnes a year. So that's our mill capacity, 25, and that's our processing capacity, 12. Then what we say is that for every bit of copper that comes out, we're going to recover 86% of it, and this is how many dollars per tonne revenue we're going to get for the recovered copper. And likewise for the gold, we're only going to get 75% of that, and that's $1,500 an ounce for the gold. So this will define our processing revenue and our processing cost and our processing capacity. And then the bottom here, we're saying that from a mining point of view, it's going to cost us $2.50 for the per tonne to mine the rock, and we've got a capacity of 70 million tonnes. So in this example that we're about to do, this little set of tests, we're going to look at 70, 80, 90 and 100 million tonnes. So for the mining capacity. So that's what this number here, we're going to be changing this number here. But also what's going to happen is that we want to add the capital for that extra mining capacity. So the capital we're going to add here to the initial capital value. So if we have, for every extra 10 million tonnes mining capacity, it's going to cost us $50 million. So our capital up there is minus 10 already. Already there's some capital that needs to be spent in the first year. We'll add another 50 million there to make it minus 60, and then have a look at what the net present value is. Okay, all good? So those two numbers you want to change. You want to change this number here, add $50 million for every $10 million of extra capacity. And just fill out the table there as to what the NPV is. I did actually have another set of cases I also wanted you to run, which was without the capital. So if you don't mind doing both those cases, with the capital, without the capital, what the NPV is for each of the cases. There's no randomness in this analysis. It's not like there's a random number generator that you sort of, it doesn't use randomness at all. It's what observations can you make from without capital? Is it all the same or nearly the same? Yeah. So one of the interesting things to note from the without capital set of cases is that after you get to 80 million tonnes, you don't need any more mining capacity than that. So adding extra mining capacity doesn't actually help you. This is a schedule at 100. Well, we never actually use 100 million tonnes mining capacity. You know, that's not driving us anymore. Just because you've got the capacity doesn't mean that you're going to use it. So the only constraint really that's active, or the only constraint that you're hitting, is the mill capacity. And there's also the reserves that you're dealing with. You don't want to just mine them really quickly just because you've got the capacity to. You want to get the most money out of them. If you want to mine it really quickly, well then you could do that, and we could look at one of those other schedules to look at what happens when you just mine stuff quickly. You don't make more money, you just mine it quickly. But there's no capital in these. So if you were to look at that, what would you say? What should you do? Increase to 80 million tonnes? So this one here, you get slightly more value. 90 million tonnes for the extra value that you have. You start losing because of the capital to get you there. And then 100, well, likewise, we're not actually using that capacity, we're just losing money. If our mining capacity was more expensive than that, more expensive than $50 million per 10 million tonnes extra capacity, what do you think would have happened? It might have pushed you from here back this way. And if it was cheaper, well, you know, maybe it would have pushed you this way, but it wouldn't have kept pushing you. Well, maybe it would have. I mean, if mining's a lot cheaper, you might start to process more of the material because it doesn't cost you so much to mine, so now it's more economic to process. So, you know, all of these things are actually independent on each other, but just as a rule of thumb or an idea of what you think is going to happen, a prediction of what's going to happen, then probably increasing reducing the costs could push you up towards a slightly bigger number. But I like the way you actually use numbers to drive your decision-making process. You don't just say increasing mining capacity makes you more money. You might start off thinking that and think, yeah, that's a good assumption. You know, if you don't have to pay for capital, it makes you more money. But then you look at the results and think, oh, why was that? And you know, go searching a little bit deeper and realise that that's because we've hit our mining capacity. That's because we've hit our processing capacity, and the economics are driving the decisions, not the capacities.
How would you look at something like replacing the fleet?
Well, you'd have to look at what's the effect on the mine from replacing the fleet. So if you've got some more trucks and shovels, then obviously there's the extra capital to buy them all. So you'd have to put that in as an initial value, the capital for all the equipment.
You'd put that in as an initial value, even if you were buying the fleet 10 years down the road?
Well, if you're doing it 10 years down the road, then really that's a time-varying property now. So that's probably the limitation of this, is that you can't do that sort of analysis. You can just sort of look at, well, if we had a new fleet now, what would it be like? Like say if you buy a new fleet, it will, there's different costs, you know, there's better costs now. So you add the extra capital, but you reduce the operating costs. Is that actually a good idea? Should you replace your fleet with new ones? Maybe you have to replace it anyway. You sort of think, okay, which one will I do? So that sort of analysis you could do.
Do as a sinking fund calculation, taking account of time value of money.
Does the sinking fund?
Yeah, so if you do it as a sinking fund calculation, then it becomes an additional annual cost. That's effectively the cost, the wearing out cost of using up your equipment.
Yeah. So I think what Brian's talking about is like people often divide the costs of capital into some they'll, what's the other word? Well, some they'll call, now I've lost both the words, sustaining capital and
Project or initial or
other capital. Yeah, anyway. So the sustaining capital people often put as a variable amount. And it's, you know, not a bad idea, you know, like initially, yep, like, yeah. So initial capital, sort of put it up front. Sustaining capital, the more you wear them out, the more you use the trucks, the more you wear them out, the more you incur those costs. So it's, yeah, it's a sort of a simple way here to do it. I mean, ideally you'd actually model the trucks as how many hours are they good for? Okay, we get to 60,000 hours. What happens then? Do we trigger a rebuild, or do we trigger a new purchase? And you actually have chunks of capital that are happening over time, you know, to replace equipment. So that's what we do in the other software. But yeah, this is keeping it simple. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what we're going to do is a similar thing for processing. So we're going to look at 5 million tonne increases in processing capacity. With each extra 5 million tonnes, it's going to cost us another $1 billion to do. It's a bit more expensive, that processing. So we'll change the processing capacity and just set this back to 70. So without changing the mining capacity, change the processing from 25 to 30 to so on, adding an extra $1 billion for every 5 million tonnes that we have, processing capacity that we have. And then there's a couple of questions down the bottom there. What would be the best processing capacity? What do you think would happen if we had less expensive processing capacity, additional capacity? What effect might that have on the decision? And what was the impact of the cut-off grade and the mine life as the processing capacity was finished, was increased? So we're just looking here at NPVs, but really sitting behind this is another schedule of decisions, a mining schedule, what's been mined, what's been processed. So you would ideally look at what happened to the mine plan for each of these cases. So at the very least, look at the cut-off grade and the mine life as you do these different options. Okay, all done? Anyone not done? No. All those processing expansions didn't seem to do too much good for us, did they? Not at $1 billion for every extra one. So if we had if we had to pay another $1 billion for every 5 million tonnes of processing capacity, we wouldn't actually do any of them. So the next thing that we're going to do is populate that bigger table. We're going to look at all the options of mining and processing together. So on section 8.6, you can see a table there. You've already done the first row and the first column. There's a few more options there. So if we fill in the matrix and then answer the questions below, what's the best choice of mine and mill expansion? Can you see any further opportunity to increase the value of the project? And the last question is, can you explain why the processing plant, the best processing plant is different depending on whether you have a mine expansion or not mine expansion?